Daniel Carter had always thought marriage would be a steady anchor in his life. For years it was exactly that, steady, predictable, and familiar. He and Emily had built a comfortable rhythm together, a house filled with soft routines and muted conversations. But lately, the silence between them had grown louder than any argument could. Their evenings together were spent in separate corners of the living room, she with her books, him with his phone, two people existing side by side but rarely colliding. There was no storm, no dramatic fallouts, only an invisible wall quietly rising brick by brick. Emily noticed the changes before Daniel admitted them to himself. She saw how often his eyes flickered to his phone at dinner, how he lingered too long before answering simple questions, how he had suddenly taken an interest in late nights at the office or extra hours at the gym. He assured her it was nothing, that work was just demanding, that he needed to clear his head. She nodded, but in the back of her mind a shadow had taken shape, one she couldn't quite name but couldn't shake either. The truth was that Daniel hadn't gone searching for temptation, it had found him. At his firm's latest campaign project, a freelance photographer had been brought in to capture images for the company's rebranding. Her name was Sophia Reed. She was younger than him by several years, confident without arrogance, with a way of seeing the world that made the ordinary feel alive. She spoke to him like she already knew the cracks in his armor, and her laughter carried a spark he hadn't realized he missed. First it was harmless. Small talk over coffee, brief exchanges about lighting and angles. But there was something in the way she held his gaze, as though she saw beyond his rehearsed professionalism, into the restless man underneath. Daniel told himself it was innocent. After all, a little conversation was nothing more than that. Yet, every time he saw her, his pulse betrayed him. He found himself rehearsing what to say, scanning the office for glimpses of her red scarf, waiting for her texts that came under the guise of project updates but stretched into late-night musings about art, life, and freedom. Emily asked one evening while folding laundry, why he seemed so far away lately. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but her eyes searched him with quiet urgency. Daniel forced a smile and kissed her forehead, muttering something about stress at work. She nodded again, but her silence lingered longer than his reassurance. He went to bed that night with the weight of her unspoken doubts pressing against his chest. Then came the invitation. Sophia mentioned an exhibition she was displaying her work in, a collection of photographs exploring light and shadow. She said he should come, that it wasn't about business, just art. Daniel hesitated, hearing Emily's voice in his head, but curiosity outweighed caution. He told Emily he had a late client dinner, kissed her cheek, and drove into the city with a nervous anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The gallery was dim, the air thick with whispers and faint music. Paintings and photographs lined the walls, but Daniel barely saw them. His eyes found Sophia instantly. She smiled in a way that pulled him closer, as though the crowd parted just for him. She led him deeper into the exhibition, past the crowded halls and into corners where shadows lingered. The lighting was low, a deliberate play of darkness and illumination. Every step further in felt like shedding the skin of the man he was supposed to be. He listened to her speak about her work, how darkness wasn't absence but presence, how shadows told as much truth as light did. Her words felt layered, carrying meanings that went beyond art. Daniel nodded, but in his mind, he wondered if she spoke of him, of them, of whatever this unspoken connection was. His hand brushed against hers as they stood close to one of her photographs, and for a moment, the world shrank into that narrow space between them. Daniel's heart raced. He could hear the echo of Emily's voice, the memory of her quiet suspicion, the reminder of vows spoken years ago. Yet standing there beneath the low glow of gallery lights, he felt something awaken in him, something reckless, something hungry. He didn't know if it was desire, loneliness, or the simple intoxication of being seen. All he knew was that he had followed Sophia into the dark, and he wasn't sure he wanted to turn back. As the night ended, Daniel walked her to her car. The city around them buzzed with distant sounds, cars, laughter, footsteps, but it all felt muffled like a dream. Sophia leaned closer, her voice low, asking if he had enjoyed himself. He answered yes, though the truth was far more complicated. He had enjoyed it too much. He had crossed a line, if not in action then in thought. Driving home, Daniel rehearsed what he would say if Emily asked about his night. But the words didn't come easily. Instead, he sat in silence, replaying Sophia's smile, the way she had led him deeper into the shadows, and the way his heart had answered without hesitation. By the time he reached his driveway, he knew something irreversible had begun. He hadn't touched her, hadn't kissed her, but in his soul, the betrayal had already taken root. Daniel woke the next morning with a faint taste of guilt, though he buried it beneath his usual routines. He made coffee, checked his emails, and kissed Emily on the cheek before leaving for work. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But inside him, something had shifted. The darkness he had stepped into with Sophia at the gallery lingered like a secret perfume, invisible but intoxicating. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more, yet his thoughts betrayed him. He found excuses to check his phone, hoping for a message, and every time it vibrated with her name, he felt the same rush as if he were 20 again. At the office, Sophia moved with the casual grace of someone who knew she had his attention. Their conversations lengthened, stretching from work matters into personal reflections. Her childhood stories, her dreams of traveling, her frustrations with the fleeting connections in her life. Daniel listened intently, realizing how rarely he listened to Emily anymore. Sophia asked about his life, his marriage, his feelings, and though he hesitated, he found himself confessing things he had never said aloud. She didn't judge. She only smiled, touched his hand briefly, and told him that everyone deserved to feel alive. Emily noticed the distance growing like a crack in glass. He smelled of cologne she hadn't bought. Sometimes faint traces of perfume clung to his jacket, and his eyes carried a glow that had nothing to do with her. She didn't confront him immediately. Emily was too deliberate for that. Instead, she observed. She stayed up later than usual, waiting for him to come home. She checked receipts left in his pockets. Each small discovery layered her suspicion into certainty, though she remained silent, waiting for him to either come back to her willingly or sink deeper into the shadows. The first time Daniel met Sophia outside of work, it was under the pretense of needing her opinion on a presentation. He told Emily he was meeting a client. Instead, he drove to a quiet cafe where Sophia sat waiting, her notebook open. Her hair tied loosely as though she hadn't planned to impress, yet somehow she did. They spoke for hours, not of work, but of life. His frustrations, her wanderlust, their shared hunger for something unnamed. When the evening ended, he promised himself it would be the last time. But even as he drove home, he knew he was lying. The next meetings were bolder. A late-night walk through the city where they lingered too long at each corner, the brush of their shoulders feeling like electricity. Then a rented hotel room, discreet and dim, where their whispers filled the silence. For a faceless story, the details lived in sound and sensation. The quiet click of the door closing, the rustle of clothing set aside, the shallow breaths caught between hesitation and surrender. Daniel told himself he was only reclaiming something lost, but deep down, he knew he was building a world that couldn't last. Every secret meeting left him torn. He would return home to Emily, who waited with calm eyes and gentle questions. "How was your dinner?" she'd ask, and he'd offer the same rehearsed answers. But in her silence, he could hear the echo of what she already suspected. Lying beside her in bed, he would replay Sophia's laughter, the softness of her touch, and wonder how he could belong to two worlds at once. Sophia, for her part, wasn't cruel or calculating. She wasn't trying to destroy his marriage. She was simply lonely, someone who craved affection and intimacy as much as he did. With Daniel, she found escape from her own isolation. With her, Daniel found the thrill of being wanted again. Together, they created a cocoon of secrecy that felt untouchable, even as the weight of their choices pressed down on them both. It wasn't just the physical closeness that haunted Daniel. It was the way Sophia looked at him, as though he was more than the man who came home tired and distracted. She saw him as capable, adventurous, alive. That vision of himself was addictive. He didn't want to let it go. Yet, every time Emily smiled at him across the dinner table or touched his arm absent-mindedly, guilt pierced through the haze of pleasure, reminding him of the life he was endangering. One night, after another hidden meeting, Daniel drove back through the city. The streets were empty, rain streaking the windshield. He thought about the choices he was making, how he was living two lives, each demanding more of him than he could give. His mind replayed Sophia's words, "You deserve to feel alive," and Emily's quiet question from weeks ago, "Why do you seem so far away?" Between them, he felt himself unraveling. By the time he pulled into the driveway, Emily was waiting at the window, the light behind her framing her silhouette. Daniel paused, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding with the weight of secrets. He had crossed the line fully now, not only in thought but in action. The darkness that had seemed thrilling now carried shadows that stretched long into his home. Yet when he stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, he still couldn't let go of the memory of Sophia's touch. In his own words, he admitted silently what he couldn't yet confess aloud. "I followed her into the dark, and found pleasure I hadn't felt in years." But with that admission came another truth. Pleasure was never free. It carried a cost, and Daniel knew the bill was coming due. Daniel woke with the weight of guilt pressing harder than the pleasure could mask. For weeks, he had been balancing two worlds, but the walls were closing in. Emily no longer asked directly where he had been. Instead, she moved with a quiet resolve, her silence louder than any confrontation. She set the dinner table for two but ate alone when he came home late. She folded his shirts but avoided his gaze when handing them over. She had already begun her grieving, mourning a marriage that was still technically intact but hollowed from the inside. The discovery came not as an explosion but as a soft unveiling. Emily had found a receipt in his pocket from a hotel she had never stepped foot in. She didn't throw it in his face, didn't demand answers. Instead, one evening she simply held it in her hand while he walked through the door, offering him a tired, knowing look. "When did I lose you?" she asked softly. The words cut deeper than any accusation. Daniel had no reply. His throat tightened, and his silence became its own confession. He had imagined this moment countless times. Imagined her screaming, imagined himself begging, imagined some chance of covering it with another lie. But Emily didn't scream. She didn't demand. She simply set the receipt on the table and walked away, leaving him with a silence heavier than any words. In that stillness, Daniel felt the walls of his carefully constructed double life collapse around him. Sophia noticed the change soon after. He no longer texted with the same fire, no longer lingered as long in her presence. The guilt he carried seeped into their moments together, staining them with unease. One evening in her apartment, as the city lights flickered through the blinds, she asked him bluntly, "Are you pulling away from me?" Daniel hesitated, caught between honesty and cowardice. Finally he whispered, "I can't keep living like this." Sophia looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a sadness that mirrored his own. She too had known this was unsustainable. For all the pleasure they had found in each other, they both realized it couldn't erase the wreckage it was leaving behind. At home, Emily no longer tried to bridge the gap. She carried herself with quiet strength, no longer pleading for his attention. She filled her evenings with books, with long walks, with friends he had barely met. Daniel watched her reclaim pieces of herself that had been dulled by years of routine, and the irony stung. While he had sought freedom in another's arms, she was finding hers by letting go of him. The house became a place of ghosts. The air was heavy with unspoken words, photographs on the wall looked like relics from another life, and every sound, a door closing, footsteps on the stairs, echoed with absence. Daniel tried to repair small things. He cooked dinner once, brought flowers home, lingered at the table longer. Emily accepted these gestures without protest but also without belief. Trust, once cracked, had shattered completely. Sophia, meanwhile, drifted further from his orbit. Their last meeting was quiet, almost tender. She told him she would be traveling soon, chasing the adventures she had always spoken of. He wished her well, though part of him longed to ask her to stay. But he knew that keeping her would only deepen the wound he had already inflicted on his marriage and on himself. When he left her apartment that night, he didn't look back. The nights that followed were long and hollow. Daniel would sit in the living room, staring at the glow of a lamp, remembering the shadows of the gallery where it had all begun. He thought about the thrill, the hunger, the intoxicating pull of being seen by someone new. But now those memories were coated in ash. What had once felt like liberation now tasted like loss. Emily eventually spoke the words he had dreaded but knew were coming. "I don't hate you, Daniel. But I can't love you the same way anymore." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and her eyes carried a sorrow that words couldn't soften. He tried to answer, to reach for her hand, but she pulled gently away. The choice wasn't his anymore. It had already been made in the silent months leading up to this moment. The final image was Daniel walking alone one night, down the same streets where he once walked with Sophia. The city pulsed around him, neon lights flickering, strangers passing without notice. He remembered her voice, "You deserve to feel alive," and Emily's haunting question, "When did I lose you?" In both, he heard the truth of his undoing. He whispered to himself almost as a confession to the dark, "In the dark I found pleasure, but I also lost the light I once had." The words lingered in the night air, dissolving into the silence. And for the first time, Daniel realized that the darkness wasn't something he had followed. It was something he had carried within him all along.